Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm Dan with Warpaint JKU, and this is the Dana 60 Regear video series. Now, this Dana 60 is going under a project vehicle that we are calling Project Maple Leaf. You'll have to check out that playlist and watch that build series to understand why. But without further ado, let's jump into the first video in this series where we're going to strip down this axle so that we have an empty housing. There are some important steps there to make sure that you pay attention to. You're also going to learn how to press in new inner seals as well as mount our ring gear on our new carrier. And we have something special planned for that. So let's dive in and check it out. And guys, before we jump into this video series, it's important to know a couple of things about the Dana 60. The Dana 60 Regear process is pretty much the same as things like a Dana 44, the Dana 70, the Dana 80, and lots of other axles. So just because you might not be regearing a Dana 60 doesn't mean that this video wouldn't pertain to you. Now, if you're not at the point where you're ready to necessarily just remove the carrier and pinion, you can watch the other videos that I've done, which I'll link in the description, which basically show you how to disassemble the axle to the point that we have it here with our carrier still installed. Now, just like a lot of the other videos I do on this channel, you're gonna need some specialized tools in order to make this job easy and be successful at it. So let's step on over and check them out. You'll have laying around their house, but the first one we're gonna use is a battery operated impact. You're obviously gonna need a set of impact sockets. This particular socket is a 1 5/16. A lot of impact socket sets won't have one that large, so you're definitely gonna need to make sure you specifically have that size. We need a metal file, torque wrench, we need some punches, we need a different style punch over here. I'll talk about why and show you guys later. Set of gloves, some large brass punches, a mallet, and a seal installation tool for the Dana series of axles. Now guys, there is another tool that we are going to need for this job, and when I say need, you don't really need it. There are some other methods instead of using this tool, but it does make the job a lot easier and you don't have to spend a lot of money on it. As you guys know, with this channel, it's about doing things on the normal everyday guy budget, which is why we're building our 1-tons and why I'm showing you guys how to do it yourself. You don't need the most expensive and high quality tools in order to do this if you're not doing it daily or doing it weekly and it's not your living. So let's step on over, let's check out that other tool that maybe isn't necessary, but certainly makes it a heck of a lot easier. Okay, that other tool is what's gonna be called a case spreader. Now this one has obviously been modified. We'll talk about why and I'll show you how to use it in just a minute. But let's step over here and also understand that we are going to be putting in a Yukon gear and axle zip locker. That's their air locker for our Dana 60. We also need a master install kit as well as our ring and pinion. So without further ado, let's dive on into this axle, start tearing it apart. Okay, so the very first thing that we need to do once we pull the diff cover off and drain the fluid is stamp our bearing caps. The reason we do that is because we need to make sure, just like with the 14-bolt video series, that our right cap stays on the right, our left cap stays on the left, and that the top stays on top on both sides. You don't want to flip those because they're machined to be perfectly round for a bearing to be installed in here. So let's stamp those with our stamp and our mallet, and then we'll move on. To stamp this is by using a set of vice grips that's going to hold one of those punches I showed you earlier. In this axle, I'm going to use the letter T. I'm going to set it on there, use the vice grips to hold it so that I don't crush my finger, and hit it with our mini sledge. And there's our T. I'm going to mark the same T in the same orientation over here on our gasket mating surface. And there we go. Now I know that those match. I'm going to go to the other side, turn our letter T sideways, do the same thing. All right, now we're going to get in there with our impact gun and zip the bolts out of our bearing caps. When you remove these, you're going to want to put them off to the side in a safe place to make sure you don't lose them. All right, guys, now at this point with our axle and the caps removed, it would be pretty easy, as you saw in the 14 bolt video, to just basically loosen those barrel adjusters and lift this out. But if you look here, you'll notice that there are no barrel adjusters. This is our outer bearing race, same thing on this side. And the way preload on this axle, right, pressure on the bearings is set up is with shims on the side of the carrier. Now, those shims not only are responsible for preload, but they're also responsible for backlash. And getting it out is sometimes pretty difficult. So we're gonna use a case spreader. And these bolts, right, on this corner here that we're basically looking at the back side of it, those are actually gonna fit into these spots on your housing, right? That's why those are there, and you've probably noticed them on axles. Maybe thought they were just for design. Well, they're for a tool just like this. Now this tool, because it's a cheaper one, was not actually wide enough for a Dana 60. It was meant for smaller axles. Now, with that said, it was advertised as being meant for a Dana 60. I bought this tool on Amazon, and of course, I'll link to it in the description. And it works just fine. I just had to cut it and make it a little wider. Being that when you're doing this kind of a project, you're probably welding yourself or know someone who can, it's really not that big of a deal. Now that our case spreader's on the housing, I made a couple of marks to help us out with this, just so that we don't get confused and wind up putting the wrong pressure and waste a bunch of time. As we said before, you only want to spread the case a couple thousandths, just enough to be able to lift the ring gear out. So we're going to basically turn this threaded rod down, and that will spread the case by putting pressure on these two nubs and opening it just a little bit. When it's time to relax the pressure, we are going to crank it the other way. Now, it's tricky with this because you don't want to keep the case spread any longer than you have to, but let's get to it. I'm going to use a big adjustable wrench and just put little increments of pressure on it until basically we feel some resistance, and that should happen pretty quickly. See, and there we go. We have just enough pressure now to lift our carrier out. Okay, you saw how easy that was with the right tool for the job. It took a number of turns, but we were able to basically open up that case and be able to get our carrier out. Now, because this is the factory carrier, there are going to be shims, like I mentioned before, but they're under the bearing. So we'll have to pull those off in just a minute and actually get a base count so that we understand kind of as a starting point where we need to go for preload and backlash, but we'll get to that later. We're gonna come after this. We're just gonna hold it with our hand, hit the pinion with that 1 5/16 socket, and zap it right off. Now, be sure to save your pinion nut because we'll use that again later. All right, at this point, we're gonna come back with our large punch and our hammer. We're gonna knock the pinion out of the carrier. Now, when you knock the pinion out, sometimes you can lift the yoke off, no big deal. Sometimes it wants to stay on there. In this case, ours wanted to stay on. I did hit it with a hammer a couple of times. It did not want to come off. So we're just gonna knock the pinion out. But be careful because the pinion is gonna fall out the other side of the carrier and onto whatever you have below. We have our catch pan down there. Not a big deal, especially because we're not gonna be reusing it. So I don't even waste time with a pinion seal remover. I just go right after it with a screwdriver. The big thing is to make sure that the tip of the screwdriver is something that you don't mind damaging, because you're going to. And it's gonna wind up being something that you can't use again in the future. So we're gonna basically just get in there with it in the right spot, hit it with a hammer, start working it out. All right. As you can see with that hammer, we were able to get that seal removed. Okay, and with that seal removed, you can see that we have a thrust washer in there and then our outer pinion bearing. Let's go stick that off to the side. Okay, and at this point, with that outer pinion bearing removed, we can see the outer pinion bearing race, which is pressed into the housing. There's also, if you look really deep inside of there, you can see the crush washer or the crush sleeve that was on our Pinion. Sometimes it comes out with it, sometimes it doesn't. In this case, it didn't. And it's actually held in there between our races with a baffle and some shims. So let's pull all of those out of there with a brass punch. And that's the key. You definitely want to use brass because it's a softer metal and you're not going to damage the housing where we're going to press in new races later. Let's get to it and then we'll talk about what we found. All right, guys, so now that we have our axle housing pretty much gutted and stripped, I just want to take a quick second to talk to you guys about the fact that I'm wearing a different shirt, right? I had to stop in the middle of filming and actually go to my real job. And the cool thing about doing this at home is it's not really that big of a sacrifice to your family, to your friends, to your real life, because you can kind of do it when you have the time, which is pretty cool. These are the inner seals, which actually go inside of our housing right here. And they're responsible for keeping the diff fluid in the housing and not going down the axle tubes and leaking out of the ends. The way I remove those is basically with a broomstick. I use like a push broomstick, or in this case, I actually used a handle from an old hydraulic floor jack that I had. The handle was basically removed. I stuck it down the axle tube, hit it with a hammer, and just knocked these out. Now, we're gonna need a special tool. I went over it at the beginning of the video in order to press the new ones back in, but after the axle is completely gutted, we wanna put a catch pan underneath it, clean it out really well. Now that we're not worried about getting anything, any nasty metal or anything into any bearings, because there aren't any, we're gonna clean it out. That is a perfect opportunity to get that done. Now that it is done, we're gonna move on. So I went over to our Yukon gear and axle ring and pinion, and I'm gonna make sure that this instruction booklet gets saved in a safe place because we're gonna need it for later. I took the ring gear out. I cleaned it up with brake cleaner. These come coated with a light film of real sticky oil on them to prevent them from rusting in the packaging. So now that it's clean, we're basically gonna take the file that I had mentioned earlier in the video and just give it a very, very light file on the back of the ring gear. And the reason we do that is because we wanna make sure that any little burrs or anything that might be on here from the machining process when it was first made aren't there. That'll help us get the result that we're looking for when it comes time to put this on our new zip locker and get it back inside and set up our gear pattern. Now, this Yukon zip locker came basically like you see it, with a bag over it to protect it in the box. It also came with all the switches and everything we need to activate it. And it also came with our air actuator. We'll talk about that later. And of course, another instruction book. Now, if you're like me, you probably don't like reading instructions, but when you have something like this that can be a little bit complicated, especially if you've never installed one before, I would take a look at it. To be honest with you, I look at the instructions every single time I do any of these because for all I know, they may have made a minor change to the machining process and some of the tolerances might be slightly different. It's always a good idea to wipe down the gear mating surface on your ring gear, or on your housing rather, or your locker, just to make sure that all the oil's gone. As you can see, there definitely was some on here. And you want to also check for burrs. Now, these are machined to such a high quality and a high tolerance that I've actually never had a burr on our Yukon locker. But it is possible, and using something like a paper towel will let you know if there's a burr there, because it'll get stuck and obviously tear into the paper towel a little bit. So it's a good idea if you have burrs to just go over it really quickly with that file like we did on the back of the ring gear. But at this point, it's time to basically drop our ring gear on our locker. Now, there's one thing I like to do to our locker before we set that ring gear on, and it's to basically mark the center of all of these, or at least a few of these bolt holes around the carrier. So I'm going to take these three, use a Sharpie, and right on the outside edge, just draw a line so that when it comes time to drop the ring gear on and line up the bolt holes, it's a lot easier for me to accomplish that. So I used this other style punch that I mentioned earlier in the video to basically put 3 marks in line with 3 ring gear bolt holes on our ring gear. And it would be time to basically take this ring gear and drop it down onto the carrier. Now that normally never works because this inner ring here is machined to such a tight tolerance with this ring that usually you can't get it on without a little trick, but we're gonna try it first. And guys, yeah, there is just no way. You can see that there is a pretty large gap all the way around here. And again, that's because those tolerances are just too tight. So here's the trick. I mentioned it in the 14 bolt video. It's gonna be the exact same thing in the Dana 60 video. In fact, I've never mounted a ring gear on a locker without having to do this. We need to heat our ring gear. So make sure that you're on good terms with your spouse because we are gonna go inside, heat up the oven to about 300 degrees, throw that ring gear in there for about 10, 15 minutes, get it good and hot so the metal expands, come back into the garage and lower it right down onto the locker with no problem. We got it fresh out of the oven, got our welding gloves here, gonna line up our marks for our bolt holes. You just saw basically, right, we marked it. We have absolutely no gap all the way around and our ring gear is on there perfectly. It's gonna cool pretty quickly when you remove it from the oven. Do not heat it with a torch, okay? Heating your ring gear with a torch will superheat certain areas faster than others. It won't work that well. You need a nice even heat on there. Now I will say, and you saw me push on it, and you heard that thud as it fell on, the tolerances on this locker are a lot tighter than they are on the factory carrier that we were dealing with on the 14 bolt. So if you heat it up and it's still not hot enough to drop on like we just did, what you can also do is put the carrier in your freezer for a few minutes, contract that, expand the ring gear steel by putting it in the oven and it will fit right together. But marking those bolt holes is an extremely important step because if they are not lined up, you're not going to be able to rotate it and move it once it's on. You're going to have to basically knock it off with a mallet and a brass punch and then go back and start fresh. It can be frustrating. I've done this a number of times, but you did see this was my first try. And it's really not all that difficult if you follow the steps. Now at this point, I have 3 bolts in there just holding the ring gear on. And as it cools, the metal will contract and it'll basically squeeze itself onto the carrier. And that will be the point where we can then torque down our new ring gear bolts from our Yukon Gear and Axle Master Install Kit. All right, and from our master install kit, we obviously have our new ring gear bolts. We have some red thread lock. I'm gonna put red thread lock on every single one of these bolts. We're gonna put them in, we're gonna tighten them down in a star pattern, like a crisscross pattern, kind of like you would do with lug nuts. And we're gonna do it in a pretty large vise so that we can hold it securely, but not damage our bearing surfaces on either end. Now, in order to save time in this video, because I know it's already starting to get a little bit long, I am not going to show you this process. We're just going to fast forward till it's done. The last step in this video is going to be to put back in our new inner seals. Now, in our Yukon Master Install Kit, we have new inner seals. It comes with everything that we need, including the ring gear bolts, which is kind of cool, right? Because the 14 bolt didn't have that. Basically, the way this is gonna go is it's basically just gonna slide right in here, and then this rubber seal seals the axle shaft to the seal and keeps all the diff fluid in our housing like we talked about earlier. I've already pressed this side in, and basically you need that special tool I mentioned earlier in this video. What I like to do is take a little bit of gear oil or diff fluid and rub it on my finger just around the inside edge here, just to lube it up the tiniest bit and help our seal slide into place, because it's obviously a very tight fit. That won't cause any leaks in the future, but it definitely helps. And then you're gonna need to set up your seal tool like this, so that you have basically what kind of looks like a plunger or a base on one side, and then you have the other side. And here's how it works. You're gonna wanna take your seal and make sure that it just lightly sits in there. It's not gonna fall out. Then you take your tool. Now, this tool, we're gonna use this side. It's got a larger diameter. It will mate up to the edge of that seal just perfectly, as you can see here, and help push it in. And what this tool will do, the other side will basically sit up against the axle tube seal surface in here, but not push directly on the seal. The diameter of this is large enough to where it won't push on the seal. We're gonna insert this and basically loosen this nut. And as we tighten the nut, you can see that it obviously gets closer. And then we'll open the nut and it'll push the seal into the tube. All right, once we have it centered on the seal on this side perfectly, we'll get an adjustable wrench on here, very slowly push it in a little bit, back it off, remove it, make sure we're pushing the seal in evenly and straight, put it back together, continue until we send it home. All right, guys, at this point, you should be patting yourselves on the back, because the first video of your Dana 60 Regear process is basically done. We have removed the original carrier. We put our ring gear on our new carrier or locker. We also removed the old pinion seals, cleaned out the housing, got the new pinion seals in, and as well as removed our pinion. Now, keep in mind, do not throw anything out. No shims, no bearings, no bearing races. Don't throw anything out. In fact, the only thing you can throw out are your old inner seals at this point. Keep everything else, because we're going to be using it for baselines and to help us make tools to press things on in future videos. Stay tuned for part 2, where we continue the Dana 60 Regear.